Hello, happy Friday. I'm Charlotte and it is quarantine story time. We are reading War and Peace. While many of us shelter in place due to COVID-19 and try to stop the spread by being considerate individuals, amongst other things. But we're also still standing for social justice and racial equality in America and around the world, indeed. So, in case anyone thought that wasn't happening, still happening. Still a work in progress. And yes, I did get my hair cut. It's really short now. I feel like it's better kind of swooped back. A little bit like Trinity. A little bit shorter than Trinity in the Matrix. Kind of like Julie Andrews' length in like Victor Victoria or even The Sound of Music. So there you go. It's also when it's like brushed out. It's a little kind of Dorothy Hamill looking. So while I lose viewership talking about my hair, let's go ahead and get back to the book. We are in Volume 3, Section 2. If this is your first time, welcome. I don't usually spend a good several minutes talking about my hair, but I just felt like it today. But usually we're reading War and Peace. And right now we are about to embark on a battle between Napoleon's forces that are invading Russia and the Russian army near Borodino. And this is the year 1812, which was kind of a big year for everybody in Western powers. Europe at war amongst themselves and then with the US. And so it's kind of a big year for battles. I don't know what Asia was doing. I mean, Australia was probably just minding their own business. South America as well. I'm going to research what everybody else was doing those years. White people were at war. A lot of white people. So, so we're in Volume 3, Part 2, Section 26, and we'll probably read 26 through 30 today. Hopefully get a good section of the book. As you may recall from yesterday, if you were able to stick through the crazy tech problems, I should have enough computer battery for today. Hey, welcome. I have the live chat up. You can say hi. Pierre is decided to go and be part of the battle, and in doing so, he's met up with Prince Andrei. This reminds Prince Andrei of, his life before the army and, the loss of his father, his sister and his son fleeing, and also, of course, his failed romance with Natasha Rostov, and his feelings for her have now come back up. And meanwhile, everyone's just preparing for battle. So without too much further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. And you can always check out the playlist, the War and Peace playlist on my channel to catch up on anything you may have missed. On the 25th of August, the eve of the Battle of Borodino, Monsieur de Busset, a prefect of the French Emperor's palace, and Colonel Favier came, the first from Paris, the second from Madrid, to see the Emperor Napoleon in his camp on Bellevue. Having changed into court uniform, Monsieur de Busset ordered that the package he had brought with him be carried to the Emperor ahead of him, and entered the front section of Napoleon's tent, where, while talking to Napoleon's adjutants who surrounded him, he occupied himself with opening the box. Favier, not going into the tent, stood talking with some of the generals of his acquaintance by his entrance. The Emperor Napoleon had not yet left his bedroom, and was finishing his toilet. Snorting and grunting, he turned now his fat back, now his hairy fat chest, under the brush with which a valet was rubbing his body. Another valet, stopping up the vial with his finger, sprayed eau de cologne over the Emperor's pampered body, with a gesture which said that he alone could know how much eau de cologne must be sprayed and where. Napoleon's short hair was wet and tousled all on his forehead, but his face, though swollen and yellow, expressed physical pleasure. Allez fermer, allez toujours, he repeated, cringing and grunting to the valet rubbing him. An adjutant who came into the bedroom to report to the Emperor how many prisoners had been taken in yesterday's action, having said what he had to say, stood by the door waiting for permission to leave. Napoleon, wincing, gave the adjutant a frowning look from under his eyebrows. Honte prisonniers, he repeated the adjutant's words. Ils se font démolir. Tant pis pour l'armée russe, he said. Elle est toujours à la ferme, he said, hunching up and pressing his fat shoulders to the brush. C'est bien, faites entrer Monsieur de Besset, and c'est que fait bien, he said to the adjutant, nodding his head. Oui, sir, and the adjutant disappeared through the door of the tent. The two valets quickly dressed His Majesty, and he, in the dark blue uniform of the guards, with firm, quick steps, went out to the reception room. Just then, Busset, his hands hurrying, was setting up the present he had brought from the Empress on two chairs facing the Emperor's entrance. But the Emperor dressed and came out so unexpectedly quickly that he did not quite have time to prepare the surprise. Napoleon noticed at once what they were doing and realized that they were not ready yet. He did not wish to deprive them of the pleasure of giving him a surprise. He pretended he did not see Mr. Busset and called Favier over to him. Napoleon listened, frowning sternly and saying something to what Favier was telling him about the bravery and loyalty of his troops who fought at Salamanca, at the other end of Europe, and who had only one thought, to be worthy of their emperor, and only one fear, to displease him. The result of the battle was lamentable. During Favier's account, Napoleon kept making ironic comments, as if he had never supposed that things could go otherwise in his absence. I must make up for that in Moscow, said Napoleon. Tantôt, he added, and called for de Busset, de Busset, who, meanwhile, had time to prepare the surprise, having set something on chairs and covered that something with a cloth. De Busset bowed low with a French courtly bow, such as only old servitors of the Bourbons knew how to bow, and approached, holding out an envelope. Napoleon turned to him cheerfully and pulled his ear. You were quick about it, I'm very glad. Well, what is Paris saying? He said, suddenly changing his previously stern expression to a most benign one. Sire, tout Paris regrette votre absence, replied de Busset, as he ought. But though Napoleon knew that Busset had to say that or something like it, and though in his moments of clarity he knew that it was not true, he was pleased to hear it from de Busset. He again honored him by touching his ear. Je suis fâché de vous avoir fait faire tant de chemin, he said. Sire, je ne m'attendais pas à moi moins que vous trouver expert de Moscow, said Busset. Napoleon smiled and raised his head distractedly, glanced to the right. The adjutant glided up to him with a gold snuff-box and held it out. Napoleon took it. Yes, a good chance for you, he said, putting the open snuff-box to his nose. You like to travel. In 3 days you will see Moscow. You probably never expected to see an Asian capital. You'll have a pleasant journey. Busset bowed in gratitude for this attention to his, hitherto unknown to him, inclination for travel. Ah, what's this? Said Napoleon, noticing that the courtiers were all looking at something covered by a cloth. Busset, with his courtly adroitness, not showing his back, half turned and withdrew 2 steps, at the same time snatching off the cover and said, A present for your Majesty from the Empress. It was a portrait painted in bright colors by Gerard of the boy born to Napoleon and the daughter of the Austrian Emperor, whom everyone, for some reason, called the King of Rome. Born to Napoleon and the daughter of the Austrian Emperor. Okay. A quite handsome, curly-headed boy with a gaze resembling the gaze of Christ in the Sistine Madonna was depicted playing bilboquet. The ball represented the terrestrial globe and the stick in his hand a scepter. It was not entirely clear precisely what the painter meant to express by presenting the so-called King of Rome skewering the terrestrial globe with a stick, but the allegory to all those who had seen the picture in Paris and to Napoleon himself obviously seemed clear and quite pleasing. Le Roi de Rome, he said, pointing to the portrait with a graceful gesture of the hand, admirable. With a typically Italian capacity for changing facial expression at will, he went up to the portrait and assumed a look of thoughtful tenderness. He felt that what he said and did now was history, and it seemed to him that the best thing he could do, he said with grandeur, owing to which his son played bilboquet with the terrestrial globe, was to show, in contrast to that grandeur, the most simple fatherly tenderness. His eyes grew dim. He moved, glanced at a chair. The chair leapt under him and sat down on it, facing the portrait. One gesture from him, and everyone went out on tiptoe, leaving the great man alone with his feelings. Having sat for a while and touched with his hand, not knowing why, himself, the roughness of a highlight on the portrait, he stood up and called back Bousset and the officer on duty. He ordered the portrait be taken out in front of the tent so as not to deprive the old guard standing near his tent of the happiness of seeing the King of Rome, the son and heir of their adored sovereign. As he expected while he was having breakfast with Monsieur de Bousset, who was deemed worthy of that honor, he heard in front of the tent the rapturous cries of the officers and soldiers of the old guard who came running to the portrait. Vive l'Empereur! Vive la Roi de Rome! Vive l'Empereur! Came the rapturous voices. After breakfast, Napoleon, in the presence of Bousset, dictated his order for the army. Court et énergique, said Napoleon, while he had personally read over the proclamation, written straight off without corrections. The order ran, Warriors, here is the battle which you wanted so much. Victory depends on you. It is necessary for us. It will provide us with all that is needed. Comfortable quarters and a speedy return to our fatherland. Act as you acted at Austerlitz, Friedland, Vitebsk, and Smolensk. Let posterity later remember with pride your exploits on this day. Let them say of you, each of you, he was in the great battle of Moscow. De la Moscova, Napoleon repeated, and having invited Mr. Bousset, the lover of travel, for a promenade, he came out of his tent to the saddled horses. Votre Majesté a trop de bonté, Bousset replied to the invitation to accompany the emperor. He wanted to sleep and did not know how and was afraid to ride on horseback. But Napoleon nodded to the traveler, and Bousset had to go. When Napoleon came out of the tent, the cries of the guards before his son's portrait became louder still. Napoleon frowned. Take him away, he said, pointing to the portrait with a gracefully majestic gesture. It's still too early for him to look upon the field of battle. Bousset, closing his eyes, inclined his head, sighed deeply, showing thereby how he was able to appreciate and understand the emperor's words. Section 27. The whole day of the 25th of August. As his historians say, Napoleon spent on horseback, studying the terrain, discussing plans presented to him by marshals, and personally giving orders to his generals. The original line of disposition of the Russian troops along the Kolochra had been broken, and part of that line, namely the Russian left flank, owing to the taking of the Shevardino Redoubt on the 24th, had moved further back. That part of the line was no longer fortified, no longer protected by the river, and before it there was only more open and level space. It was obvious to everyone, military and non-military, that this part of the line ought to be attacked by the French. It seemed that for that there was no need for much reflection, no need for much consideration and botheration on the part of the emperor and his marshals, and no need at all for that especially superior quality known as genius, which people like so much to ascribe to Napoleon. But the historians who later described the event, and the people who then surrounded Napoleon, and he himself, thought otherwise. Napoleon rode over the field, profoundly studying the terrain.
15 minutes.
No.
How much time? 30 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry. Napoleon rode over the field, profoundly studying the terrain, nodding approvingly to himself or shaking his head mistrustfully, and without informing the generals who surrounded him of that profound course of thought which guided his decisions, told them only his final conclusion in the form of orders. Having listened to a suggestion of Davout, having known as the Duke of Eckmühl, having about turning the Russian left flank, Napoleon said that there was no need to do that, without explaining why there was no need. To the suggestion of General Compiz, who was to attack the Fleches, that he lead his division through the woods, Napoleon gave his consent, though the so-called Duke of Ecklingen, that is, Ney, allowed himself to observe that moving through the woods was dangerous and might break up the division. Having examined the terrain in front of the Shevardino Redoubt, Napoleon reflected for a time in silence and pointed to the places on which 2 batteries were to be set up by tomorrow and to go into action against the Russian fortifications, and to the places next to them where the field artillery was to be lined up. After giving this and other orders, he returned to his headquarters, and the disposition of the battle was drawn up at his dictation. This disposition, which French historians speak of with rapture and other historians with deep respect, was the following. At dawn, 2 new batteries, set up during the night on the plain occupied by the Duke of Eckmühl, will open fire on the 2 opposing batteries of the enemy. At the same time, the commander of artillery of the First Corps, General Nutti, with 30 guns of the Compans division and all the Howitzers of Dessaix and Friant's division, will move forward, open fire, and rain shells on the enemy battery, against which there will be in action 24 guns of the Guards artillery, 30 guns of the Compans division, and 8 guns of Friant and Dessaix's division, 62 guns in all. The commander of the artillery of the 3rd Corps, General Foch, will place the howitzers of the 3rd and 8th Corps, 16 in all, on the flanks of the battery designated to bombard the left fortification, which will bring against it a total of 40 guns. General Sorbière should be ready at the first order to bring forward all the howitzers of the Guards artillery against one or the other fortification. In the course of the cannonade, Prince Poniatowski will advance on the village through the woods and outflank the enemy's position. General Compans will move through the woods in order to take the first fortification. After entering into combat in this way, the orders will be given in accordance with the enemy's actions. The cannonade on the left flank will begin as soon as the cannonade on the right wing is heard. The riflemen of Morand's division and of the Viceroy's division will open heavy fire when they see the attack begin on the right wing. The Viceroy will take the village and cross its 3 bridges, proceeding at the same level as the divisions of Morand and Gérard, which, under his leadership, will head for the redoubt and fall in with the other troops of the army. All this will be carried out in order, le tout se fera avec ordre et méthode, sparing as far as possible the troops of the reserve. In the imperial camp of Mosheist, 6 September 1812. This disposition, drawn up quite vaguely and confusedly, if one allows oneself to consider Napoleon's instructions without religious awe of his genius, contained 4 points, 4 instructions. Not one of these instructions was or could be carried out. The disposition says, first, that the batteries set up at the places chosen by Napoleon, along with the guns of Pertnetti and Fouche, lined up with them, 102 guns in all, should open fire and rain shells on the Russian fleches and redoubts. That could not be done, since from the places designated by Napoleon, the projectiles did not reach the Russian works, and those 102 guns were shooting into the void until the nearest commander, contrary to Napoleon's order, moved them forward. The second instruction was that Poniatowski, heading towards the village through the woods, would turn the left wing of the Russians. That would not and could not be done because Poniatowski, heading for the village through the woods, met Tuchkov there, who blocked his way and so did not and could not outflank the Russian position. The third instruction, General Compans will move through the woods in order to take the first fortification. Compans' division did not take the first fortification, but was repulsed because, on emerging from the woods, it had to form up under canister shot, something Napoleon did not foresee. The fourth, the Viceroy will take the village, Borodino, and cross its 3 bridges, proceeding at the same level as the divisions of Morand and Gérard, of which it is not said where and when they would move, which, under his command, will head for the redoubt and fall in with the troops of the army. As far as one can tell, if not from this muddled sentence, then from the attempts that the Viceroy made to carry out the orders given him, he was to move through Borodino from the left towards the redoubt, while the divisions of Morand and Gérard were to move simultaneously from the front. All that, like the other points of the disposition, was not and could not be carried out. Having gone through Borodino, the Viceroy was driven back on the Kolosha and could go no further. The divisions of Morand and Gérard did not take the redoubt, but were repulsed, and the redoubt was taken only at the end of the battle by the cavalry, probably something unforeseen by and unheard of for Napoleon. Thus, none of the instructions of the disposition were or could be carried out. But it was said in the disposition that, after entering into combat in this way, orders will be given in accordance with the enemy's actions, and therefore it would seem that during the battle, Napoleon would be giving all necessary instructions. But that was not and could not be done, because during the whole time of the battle, Napoleon was so far away from it that, as it turned out afterwards, the course of the battle could not be known to him, and not one of his instructions during the battle could be carried out. Well. Section 27. Many historians say that the Battle of Borodino was not won by the French because Napoleon had a cold, that if he had not had a cold, his instructions before and during the battle would have been of still greater genius, and Russia would have perished. Et la face du monde et changé. For historians who accept that Russia was shaped by the will of one man, Peter the Great, and that France was turned from a republic into an empire, and French troops went to Russia by the will of one man, Napoleon, such an argument that Russia remained a power because Napoleon had a bad cold on the 26th, such an argument for such historians is inevitably consistent. If it had depended on Napoleon's will, either whether or not to fight the Battle of Borodino, if it had depended on his will whether or not to give this or that instruction, then it is obvious that a cold having an influence on the expression of his will could have caused the salvation of Russia, and therefore the valet who forgot to give Napoleon his waterproof boots on the 24th was the savior of Russia. By this way of thinking, this conclusion is indubitable. As indubitable as the conclusion which Voltaire drew jokingly, not knowing at what himself, when he said that the night of St. Bartholomew was the result of Charles IX having an upset stomach. But for people who do not admit that Russia was shaped by the will of one man, Peter I, and that the French Empire arose and the War of Russia began by the will of one man, Napoleon, this argument seems not only incorrect but unreasonable, and also contrary to all human essence. To the question of what constitutes the cause of historical events, a different opinion presents itself, which is that the course of the world events is predestined from on high, depends on coincidence of all the wills of the people participating in those events, and that Napoleon's influence on the course of those events is only external and fictitious. Strange as it may seem at first glance to suggest that the night of St. Bartholomew, the order for which was given by Charles IX, did not occur by his will, but that it only seemed to him that he had called for it, and that the slaughter of 80,000 men at Borodino did not occur by the will of Napoleon, though he had gave the orders for the beginning and the course of the battle, but that it only seemed to him that he called for it. As strange as this suggestion may seem, human dignity, which tells me that each of us is, if not more, then certainly no less of a human being than the great Napoleon, calls for the allowance of this solution to the problem, and historical research abundantly confirms the suggestion. In the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon did not shoot at anyone and did not kill anyone. That was all done by the soldiers, which means it was not he who killed people. The soldiers of the French army went to kill Russian soldiers in the Battle of Borodino not as a result of Napoleon's orders, but by their own will. The whole army, the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Poles, hungry, ragged, and exhausted by the campaign, on seeing the army that blocked their way to Moscow, felt that le vin est terre et qu'elles font les bois. If Napoleon had now forbidden them to fight the Russians, they would have killed him and gone to fight the Russians because it was necessary for them. When they heard the order of Napoleon, who in return for their mutilation and death presented them in consolation with the words of posterity about their having been at the Battle of Moscow, they cried "Vive l'Empereur!" just as they cried "Vive l'Empereur" on seeing the depiction of the boy skewering the terrestrial globe with the bilboquet stick, just as they would cry "Vive l'Empereur" to any nonsense that was told them. They had nothing left to do but cry "Vive l'Empereur" and go to fight in order to find food and rest as victors in Moscow, which meant it was not the result of Napoleon's order that they killed their own kind. It was not Napoleon who ordained the course of the battle, because nothing of his disposition was carried out, and during the battle he did not know what was happening in front of him. Which meant also that the way these people were killing each other occurred not by the will of Napoleon, but went on independent of him, by the will of hundreds of thousands of people who took part in the common action. To Napoleon only seemed that the whole thing was happened by his will, and therefore the question of whether Napoleon had or did not have a cold is of no greater interest in history than the question of the last convoy of soldiers having a cold. Napoleon's cold on the 26th of August had still less significance, since the evidence of writers that, owing to Napoleon's cold, his disposition and his instructions during the battle were not as good as previously is totally incorrect. The disposition quoted above was not at all worse, but even better than all the previous dispositions by which his battles had been won. His imaginary instructions during the battle were also no worse than previous ones, but exactly the same as ever. But the disposition and the instructions seemed worse than the previous ones because the Battle of Borodino was the first that Napoleon did not win. All the most excellent and profoundly conceived dispositions and instructions seem very bad, and even military experts criticize them with a significant air when the battle is not won through them, and the worst dispositions and instructions seem very good, and serious men write whole volumes proving the merits of bad instructions when the battle is won through them. The disposition drawn up by Weyrother for the Battle of Austerlitz was the picture of perfection in the works of that sort, but all the same it was condemned for its perfection, for being excessively detailed. In the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon fulfilled his function as the representative of power just as well and even better than in other battles. He did nothing to harm the course of the battle. He bowed to the more well-reasoned opinions. He caused no confusion. He did not contradict himself, did not get frightened, and did not run away from the battlefield. But his great tact and experience of war calmly and worthily fulfilled his role of seeming to command. Section 29. Having returned from a second preoccupied ride along the line, Napoleon said, "The chessmen are set up. The game starts tomorrow." Calling for punch to be served and sending for Bousset, he started a conversation with him about Paris, about some changes he intended to make in the Maison de l'Impératrice, astonishing the prefect by his knowledge of all the minute details of court relations. He interested himself in trifles, joked about Bousset's love of travel, and chatted away casually as a famous, self-asserted surgeon who knows his job does as he rolls up his sleeve and puts on his apron while the patient is being strapped to the cot. The whole matter is in my hand and in my head, clearly and definitely. When I have to get it down to it, I'll do it like nobody else, but now I can joke, and the more calm and jocular I am, the more assured, calm, and astonished at my genius you should be. Having finished his second glass of punch, Napoleon went to rest before the serious business which, as it seemed to him, faced him the next day. He was so concerned with the business facing him that he could not sleep, and despite his cold, aggravated by the evening's dampness, at 3 o'clock that night, loudly blowing his nose, he went out to a large section of the tent. He asked if the Russians were still there. The reply was that the enemy's fires were still in the same places. He nodded his head approvingly. The adjutant on duty came into the tent. "Eh bien, Rapp, croyez-vous que nous ferons de bonnes affaires aujourd'hui?" he addressed him. "Sans aucun doute, sire," answered Rapp. Napoleon looked at him. "Vous rappelez-vous, sire, ce que vous m'avez fait l'honneur de dire à Smolensk," said Rapp. "Le vin est tard, il fait le boire." Napoleon frowned and sat silently for a long time, his head on his hand. "C'est pauvre amie," he said. "Elle est bien diminuée depuis Smolensk. La fortune est un franche courtisan, Rapp. Je le disais toujours, et je commence à l'éprouver. Mais le garde, Rapp, le garde est intact?" he asked questioningly. "Oui, sire," answered Rapp. Napoleon took a lozenge, put it in his mouth, and looked at his watch. He had no wish to sleep. Morning was still far off. It was no longer possible to kill time by giving any sort of instructions, because they had all been given and were now being carried out. "Est-on distribue les biscuits et les riz au régiment de la garde?" Napoleon asked sternly. "Oui, sire." "Mais les riz?" Rapp answered that he had conveyed the sovereign's orders about the rice, but Napoleon shook his head in displeasure, as if he did not believe that his order had been carried out. A servant came in with punch. Napoleon called for another glass to be served to Rapp, and silently sipped from his own. "I have no taste or smell," he said, sniffing the glass. "I'm tired of this cold. They talk about medicine. What good is medicine if they can't cure a cold? Corvisart gave me these lozenges, but they don't help at all. What can they cure? It's impossible to cure. Notre corps, une machine à vivre. Il est organisé pour le cela. C'est sa nature. Laissez le faire. La vie est son arrêt. Qu'elle se défend d'elle-même. Elle ne fera plus que c'est vous. Le paralyse et le encombrant de remèdes. Notre corps est comme un montre parfait que d'autres allaient en septembre. Le horloger n'a pas la faculté de le ouvrir. Il ne peut le manier qu'étant les yeux bons. Notre corps est une machine à vivre. Voilà tout. And as if entering a path of definitions, which Napoleon liked, he suddenly made a new definition. "Do you know, Rapp, what the art of war is?" he asked. "It's the art of being stronger than the enemy at a certain moment. Voilà tout." Rapp said nothing. "Demain nous allons avoir affaire à Kutuzov," said Napoleon. We'll see. Remember, he was in command of the army in Braunau, and in 3 weeks never once got on a horse to inspect the fortifications. We'll see. He glanced at his watch. It was only 4 o'clock. He did not want to sleep. The punch was finished, and there was still nothing to do. He stood up, paced back and forth, put on a warm tunic and a hat, and left the tent. The night was dark and damp. A barely perceptible dampness fell from above. Low fires burned nearby, among the French guards, and glimmered far off through the smoke along the Russian line. It was quiet everywhere, and one could clearly hear the rustling and tramping of the French troops, already beginning to move and take up their positions. Napoleon walked about in front of his tent, looked at the fires, listened to the tramping, and passing by a tall guard in a shaggy hat who was standing watch by his tent, and like a black post, drew himself to attention when the emperor appeared, stopped in front of him. "What year did you join the service?" he asked, with that habitual affection of gruff and affectionate soldierliness with which he always addressed his men. The soldier told him, "Ah, und des vieux! Did your regiment get rice?" "Yes, your majesty." Napoleon nodded his head and left him. At 5:30, Napoleon was riding on horseback to the village of Shevardino. It was beginning to grow light. The sky cleared. Only one cloud lay in the east. The abandoned campfires were going out in the faint light of morning. To the right, a dense, solitary cannon shot rang out, raced by, and died away amidst the general silence. Several minutes passed by. A second, a third shot rang out. The air shook. A fourth, a fifth rang out nearby and solemnly somewhere to the right. The sound of the first shots still hung in the air when others rang out, more and more, merging and interrupting each other. Napoleon and his suite rode up to the Shevardino redoubt and dismounted. The game had begun. Section 30. On returning to Gorky from seeing Prince Andrei, Pierre, having told his groom to prepare the horses and awaken him early in the morning, fell asleep at once behind the partition in a corner that Boris had given up to him. By the time Pierre fully awoke the next morning, there was no one in the cottage. The panes were rattling in the little windows. The groom was standing there trying to rouse him. "Your Excellency! Your Excellency! Your Excellency!" the groom muttered insistently without looking at Pierre, shaking him by the shoulder and clearly having lost all hope of waking him up. "What? It's begun? It's time?" said Pierre, now awake. "Listen to the shooting, if you please," said the groom, a retired soldier. "All the gentlemen are gone. His Serenity rode by long ago." Pierre hurriedly dressed and ran out to the porch. Outside it was clear, fresh, dewy, and cheerful. The sun, having just burst from behind the cloud that had covered it, sprayed its rays, half broken by the cloud, across the roofs of the street opposite, over the dew-covered dust of the roads, over the walls of the houses, the windows, the fences, and Pierre's horses which were standing by the cottage. The roar of cannon was clearly heard outside. An adjutant and a Cossack trotted down the road. "It's time, Count, it's time," the adjutant called out. Ordering the horse to be led after him, Pierre went down the road to the barrow from which he had looked over the battlefield the day before. There was a crowd of military on the barrow. The French talk of the staff officers could be heard, and Kutuzov's grey head could be seen in its white cap with the red band, and his grey nape sunk into his shoulders. Kutuzov was looking through a field glass down the high road in front of him. Going up the steps of the barrow, Pierre looked ahead of him and froze in delight at the beauty of the spectacle. It was the same panorama he had admired from the barrow the day before, but now the whole terrain was covered with troops and the smoke of gunfire, and the slanting rays of the bright sun, rising behind and to the left of Pierre, cast over it in the clear morning air a piercing light of a pink and golden hue and long, dark shadows. The distant woods, ending the panorama, as if carved from some precious yellow-green stone, displayed the curved line of its treetops on the horizon, and between them, beyond Bellevue, cut the Smolensk high road, all covered with troops. Golden fields and copses glistened closer by. Everywhere, ahead, to the right, to the left, troops could be seen. It was all lively, majestic, and unexpected, but what struck Pierre most of all was the sight of the battlefield itself, Borodino and the hollows above the Kolochha on both sides of it. Above the Kolochha, in Borodino and on both sides of it, especially the left, where the Voyna, between its swampy banks, flowed into the Kolochha, hung the mist which melts, dissolves, and turns translucent in the bright sun, and magically colors and outlines everything that shows through it. This mist merged with the smoke of gunfire, and everywhere over this mist and smoke gleams of morning light flashed, on the water, on the dew, on the bayonets of the soldiers who crowded along the banks and in Borodino. Through this mist the white churches the white church could be seen, and here and there the roofs of Borodino cottages, here and there solid masses of soldiers, here and there green caissons and cannon. And all this was moving, or seemed to be moving, because of the mist and smoke spreading over the entire expanse. As in the hollow terrain near Borodino, covered with mist, so outside it, higher and especially to the left, along the whole line, over the woods, over the fields, in the hollows and up on the heights, puffs of cannon smoke were ceaselessly born of themselves, out of nothing, now singly, now in flocks, now sparse, now in rapid succession, and, swelling, spreading, billowing, merging, could be seen over the whole expanse. This smoke of gunfire, and strange to say it, the sound of it, made up the chief beauty of the spectacle. Poof! Suddenly a round, compact puff of smoke was seen, a splay of purple, gray, and milky white, and boom! A second later came the sound of this smoke. Poof, poof! 2 puffs of smoke rose up, jostling and merging, and boom, boom! Came the sounds confirmed what the eyes had seen. Pierre turned back to the first puff of smoke, which he had left as a round, compact ball, and in its place there were already balloons of smoke drawing to one side, and poof, with a pause, poof, poof, another 3, another 4 were born, and to each, with the same intervals, boom, 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 came the beautiful, firm, sure sounds in response. It seemed that these puffs of smoke now raced along, now stood still, and past them raced woods, fields, and gleaming bayonets. On the left side, over the fields and bushes, these big puffs of smoke with their solemn echoes were ceaselessly being born, and still closer, over the hollows and woods, burst out the small puffs of musket smoke, having no time to become round, and in the same way gave their own little echoes. Trat-tat-tat, rattled the muskets rapidly but irregularly and meagerly in comparison with the firing of the ordnance. Pierre wanted to be there where those puffs of smoke, those gleaming bayonets and cannons, those movements, those sounds were. He turned to look at Kutuzov and his suite, so as to compare his impression with those of the others. Everyone was looking ahead at the battlefield as he was, and it seemed to him with the same feeling. On all the faces there now shone that hidden warmth, chaleur latente, a feeling which Pierre had noticed the day before, and which he had understood perfectly after his conversation with Prince Andrei. "Go, dear boy, go. Christ be with you," Kutuzov was saying, without taking his eyes from the battlefield, to a general standing next to him. Having heard the order, this general walked past Pierre to the path down from the barrow. "To the crossing," the general said coldly and sternly in reply, when one of the staff officers asked him where he was going. So am I, thought Pierre, and he went in the same direction after the general. The general was getting on his horse, brought him by a Cossack. Pierre went over to his groom, who was holding the horses. Asking which was the quieter, Pierre climbed onto the horse, clutched at its mane, pressed the heels of his splayed feet into the horse's belly, and feeling that his spectacles were falling off and that he could not let go of the mane and the reins, galloped after the general, provoking smiles from the staff of officers who were watching him from the barrow. And we're going to just pause it there until Monday, because the next section seems a bit long. And I guess it's a nice little cliffhanger as we just get into the warm-up of the battle, so we can ponder that over the weekend and wonder how it'll turn out. And for those who actually know Russian and European history quite well, they probably, well, as they've said, Napoleon's going to lose Borodino, but what of our friends will make it out in this battle? And I just think it's so, I still love all of Tolstoy's little comments on things. I feel like he writes about Napoleon. Some of the things he writes about, Napoleon, it comes from that, like being a Russian and, his having lived through it and sort of disdain for Napoleon. But yeah, I love this part about how afterwards people dissect all these instructions, and whether they're good or bad, they, make much out of them if they win because, through it, or if they criticize it if they lose through it, never minding whether it's actually a good or bad instruction in and of itself. And he talks a lot about that, about how in hindsight we try to justify all these things, which is a very uniquely human thing that we continue to do. So yes, even if you're just getting into the battle, you're gonna have to wait. I'm sorry. Our time is drawing to a close, and we'll save the meat of the battle for Monday, because I'm sure there'll be much too much to get into now. So, with that note, stay safe. Boo. All right. Well, stay safe. Have a good weekend, folks.